Hi, Dave.
Hey, Matt. What's up?
Not much. To introduce myself, I'm Matthew Yglesias. I'm a fellow and blogger at the Center for American Progress.
I'm David Weigel. I'm a reporter at the Washington Independent. I'm here on the trail in a hotel room in Watertown, New York.
In the New York 22.
23.
23.
It's even better. Yeah.
Even better. Well, maybe we should just to start up, because this is one of these things where political junkies are, obsessed with this race because there's not any other congressional elections happening. But I think normal people probably don't even know the background to it. This all started when John McHugh was a sort of a moderate Republican who'd been representing that district. He accepted a position as Secretary of the Army, right?
He did. He accepted it. He actually was held up for a while because senators were filibustering him. I think Jim DeMint was filibustering him, which is the way the Senate works now, which is a different topic. But he was held up for a while. The election was called for November 3rd, and it looked at first as if a Republican would probably win, but Democrats had a chance, because that's what usually happens in this district. Obama carried it last year. Republicans usually win the House seat. Right. But it became like Republicans and Democrats both, instead of having primaries, in New York what you do is you have a meeting of the party committees and you choose a candidate in maybe it's not literally a back room, or maybe it's not full of smoke, but it's a room full of party hacks instead of
some kind of room.
People. So they chose this liberal-leaning Republican candidate, Dita Skozafava, and I use that term even though it's been proven her voting record is slightly to the right of the average in New York. For national Republicans, for a reason we can go into, she was unacceptably liberal. She would have been probably the most liberal member of the Republican Conference.
Right. Well, I mean, I guess just as a shorthand for it, I mean, she had the support of sort of a substantial number of labor groups, right, of unions and of this thing they have in New York called the Working Families Party, which in New York State's sort of complicated politics is basically a sort of like specifically pro-union political organization that normally endorses left-wing Democrats, but apparently can sort of tactically reach out to Republicans who are friendly to their kind of key causes. So,
well, what advantage she had was her husband is a union organizer in the district, Ron McDougal. So yeah, she was not the usual Republican, and like the smart Republicans thought this would help her box out the Democrat by getting all these endorsements. And it might have.
And I guess it's worth saying, because I've been pointing out in my blog that this sort of analysis that's been done by political scientists shows that she's somewhat to the right of the average Republican in the state assembly. But some people on email did point out to me that the New York State legislature is a bit of an odd duck, and in particular the Republicans in the assembly have this kind of permanent entrenched minority status, and policy making, it doesn't really kind of happen there, so it's not totally clear how good an indication to where someone really stands those kind of votes are, and so there's a reason for conservative activists to look at her kind of interest group connections and see that that's not the kind of person who the National Republican Party would really ever have put forward.
No, they wouldn't, and they were. Some of them let themselves be coerced into doing so, like Newt Gingrich. But, I mean, all of that is moot now, because what happened as I was in a plane on the way to this district was that Skozafava, the sequence of events is that a Siena poll came out, which showed Skozafava falling into third place badly, with no chance of winning. Shortly thereafter, she announced that she was leaving the race. Shortly after that, yesterday morning, and we were talking on Monday, so yesterday morning, she endorsed the Democrat. And this was a sequence of events like Democrats cleverly got her endorsement, while Republicans, who have found themselves all supporting the Conservative Party candidate. And this is all so labyrinthine. I mean, I think it's no other state is quite like New York, where you have these realistic third parties that can win things.
Right. Well, but, I mean, New York has this unique
really make an effort to win this woman over.
System that keeps these third parties in the public eye. I mean, but initially, because one thing that happens in New York basically is that you have the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, and then you also have these other parties waiting in the wings. One called the Liberal Party and one called the Independence Party that both exist kind of as patronage organizations. And then you have working families on the left and conservatives on the right. And normally the Conservative Party will endorse the Republican nominee, but it holds out the right in any given race to withhold that endorsement and instead run its own candidate. And when that happens, I mean, usually the understanding is that this is deliberately a spoiler effort, that the conservatives will run a guy to your right, make the Republican lose the election, and therefore give all other Republicans in the state sort of reason to pay some attention to what the Conservative Party leadership thinks and what the conservative base thinks. And I think that's how most people initially saw what was happening here, was as a case where a kind of from the right challenger to Scozzafozza might well throw the election to the Democrat.
Yeah.
And where it got unusual was when this kind of, national conservative constituency really wound up getting behind Hoffman, the Conservative Party guy, to the point where he was pushed, into sort of first-tier candidates.
It actually, and it, ironically enough, began with the Weekly Standard. I think there have been a number of conservative bloggers taking credit or dishing credit out for who deserves the most. I mean, they all agree Republicans deserve no credit because they were waffling on whether to support the conservative candidate Hoffman or Scozzafozza, the Republican. But it was actually the Weekly Standard read an article in early September by Ken Tomlinson, who used to be the editor of Reader's Digest and who's gone on to be just a conservative writer around town, written a book about Iran, how Iran's going to kill us all, things like that. And he just wrote this sort of, let's fill up the magazine story about the Jim Buckley scenario, where, Jim Buckley was William F. Buckley's brother who surprisingly won a Senate seat in New York State in 1970 with in a three-way split between a liberal Republican, a liberal Democrat, and himself. Now, I read this article and said, well, important to remember, New York used to be a swing state at that time. There used to be more liberal Republicans,
right.
And the Democrats, I don't want to go back. I can't go back and see how they did in that district, but Democrats won this district for Barack Obama last year, so that seems overly optimistic. But that actually was insanely influential in conservative opinion making and activist circles. I mean, these guys, they've been laughed at all year, but these conservative bloggers and Tea Party people and people on Facebook, at Twitter, et cetera, who, sometimes seems like they're just kind of congratulating each other for doing the same stuff. They all spread this around and got interested in the race. They packed up what they were doing and came here, and you saw a wave of the Club for Growth. I think they might have endorsed. They endorsed Hoffman around the same time, and they deserve the credit for making it clear that he would have money, which is what really matters here. But just this intellectual movement sprung up around Hoffman, who is, I should point out, he's conservative, but he's utterly unexamined. I mean, I just got back from a rally that Joe Biden was holding for Bill Owens, who I think we were just now mentioning as the Democratic candidate in this race. And I talked to Scozzafozza's husband. I talked to local Democratic officials, and they're kind of can't believe that Hoffman's competitive because he's just such a phenom that no one has really figured out what he believes beyond what the Club for Growth tells people to believe.
Right. Well, and I know this is it's sort of a frustration in Democratic circles, the way this played out, that I think they see, one way they could have won this race is with Scozzafozza in the race, doing resources, sort of pulling away votes of moderate Republicans in the district, and Owens wins kind of in a three-way. Another would be if they had just had a sort of two-way race for months and months and months, in which case it would have been possible for Owens to, spend time making the case against Hoffman, pointing out that, the way he got all the support he's gotten has been by taking, sort of hard right stands on everything. He doesn't have, a real record.
Well, neither kid has a record. Neither guy's ever been elected anything.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But, it's so the point, if it had been sort of a head-to-head matchup, they could have had a dozen rallies with, Obama administration figures and whatever in a district where, it's been Republican leading traditionally, but had moderate Republican representatives, voted for Barack Obama, voted for Hillary Clinton, and so it seems like, a straight up orthodox Democrat against, sort of far right guy, you could win, but by dropping out so suddenly over the weekend, the race isn't really going to develop either way as a sort of two-person race where voters sort of hear the case against the other candidates.
The thing the Democrats are worried about is because of this position Hoffman was in, we just talked about, generally voters like populism and like independence as neutral values hovering over an election.
Right.
So Hoffman's campaign has, there was people working canvassing for him who have, he's pro-life, he'll stop the gays from getting married. I've seen Tea Party people who have like anti-acorn signs, but like his messaging is generally, I'm an independent, I've never been elected to anything, I'll clean up Washington. I hate the earmarks, and I mean, I interviewed him before the race really blew up, and I was kind of nudging him on his positions and saying, would you repeal all the stimulus funding? And he wasn't waffling per se, but it was clear that he hadn't been asked a lot of these questions. Just like local reporters were not nailing him on this stuff. So like Democrats are dealing not with a hard right candidate, but somebody who I think the electorate perceives as this, John Wayne, him against the bosses guy. And like ideology, I mean, it's going to be spun as an ideological election, but at this point, it's really just what narrative they prefer. And like Hoffman, because this is a narrative.
Well, and now he gets the benefit of being de facto a major party nominee in organizational terms and so forth. But with that, because obviously, as you say, people like independence. They don't like partisanship. They like the idea of outsiders. But in practice, independents have a very hard time getting elected because they don't have a political party backing them. But he does have, all that. He has this donor base. He has this activist network and support. Now he has the support of the NRCC and, whatever the sort of city and county Republican parties are in that district are all going to be pulling for him. But he gets to be, an outsider, from neither party, which is, it's a neat trick when the stars align in this particular
it's enviable.
Way.
But I mean, you've seen how the media can decide that somebody's independent and just ride that. I mean, I think Hoffman hasn't quite gotten quite as much gooey coverage as like Joe Lieberman or John McCain got in this regard. But there has been there has been some examination of this. But these Democrats. They've got these union endorsements now from people who had endorsed Skozafava, and like I'm talking to Skozafava's husband and asking if it's and he's like, well, we're trying. It's the worst situation where you've got kind of all the official party apparatuses in a really weak state versus Hoffman, and it's really every conservative organization that's worth anything is now bought into this race. And it's strange because I don't think voters understand what they are. I got this this mailer this piece of literature that the Susan B. Anthony list, which is a pro-life group that's been in here forever, is dropping. And it's like, endorsed by Michelle Malkin, endorsed by Citizens United PAC, endorsed by Fred Thompson. And like, I don't think most voters are going to take that now. Oh, well,
most people probably don't know who
Michelle
Malkin is,
no, it's just that, he's the independent,
Maybe shift gears in the direction of Connecticut's independent third-party Senator Joe Lieberman, who, I think a lot of sort of progressive activists where the sort of bitter, ironic thing that's been going around is the quote, he's with us on everything but the war, which is
what... Was that Harry Reid said that?
Yeah, I mean, it's what left-wing activists were told. And then again, when Lieberman was being welcomed back into the fold after he endorsed John McCain, Reid said something like, he's a great progressive legislator. And yet here he is. He's taken... I mean, a lot of moderate Democrats have taken positions against the public option in health care, but Lieberman has really been the most aggressive. I mean, even more so than people who need to represent, Nebraska, Arkansas, Louisiana in the Senate. he's got a new op-ed out today, that's just kind of...
Is it Wall Street Journal? Or?
No, it's in a local Connecticut paper. I think he writes a regular column for it, maybe. But it's indistinguishable, really, from what a Republican senator would be saying on it. And on an issue where this did not sort of go to the notional things that Lieberman was disagreeing with Democrats about back in 2006.
No, I know that it got garbled a little bit. I mean, he didn't support the public option the way that it's being presented right now. This is a bit fresh, but he gave voters the strong impression when he ran for vice president, ran for president, and ran for re-election to the Senate that he like every Democrat since Truman supported some sort of national health care, right? I'm not
right.
I don't remember him being this much of a deficit hog. That's his rationale, isn't it? That we can't add to this much of the deficit and create a new entitlement as we're facing this huge financial crunch.
Right. I mean that's what he says. But I mean, of course, the president has said he won't sign a bill that expands the deficit. So all the drafts that are being talked about are. Deficit neutral, even deficit reducing. I mean, they, as conservatives will tell you, involve spending a lot of money, but they cover it with, reductions in sort of Medicare overpayments and also with some new taxes. Lieberman's 2004 presidential campaign, I saw some liberal bloggers say, well, Lieberman was for the public option when he ran in 2004. I think the concept that we now know of as the public option didn't really exist back then, but he was definitely for expanding existing public sector healthcare programs in 2004. That was very much sort of at the heart of his agenda. And actually, I mean, if you look at his 2004 campaign, his political strategy there was that he was positioning himself as to the right, very far to the right for a Democrat on national security issues, but, quite firmly on the left on healthcare and environmental policy stuff, on basically, the stuff that's the mainstay of today's political.
Is your sense that he's dishonest about it, or that he's motivated by pique, or what? Because I think there is a coherent case to make, if one was making it for years and years, not so much if one picks it up now, coherent case to make that, we can't, even though this projected cut the deficit, we've seen what happens with entitlements in the past, and we can't do this right now as we face the recession. It's a Republican argument, but it's a coherent one. I mean, is the sense that he actually agrees with this, or that he's running the latest of his guerrilla campaigns against the people who wronged him?
Well, I think part of the sort of history of both Lieberman and his friend John McCain is a tendency to make very sort of big policy lurches based on a kind of evolving personal relationships with people. That when John McCain was sort of at the height of his anger against George W. Bush, he became, not just a maverick, but for several years was one of the least conservative Republicans in the Senate, which was totally at odds with his previous record and was a position he abandoned basically after Bush's reelection when the two of them had some level of kind of reconciliation there. Lieberman's always been a kind of a camera hog. He's always been, someone who's very interested in the idea that he's a centrist rather than in kind of fixed policy positions. In some ways, I think the best illustration of this might be on climate issues rather than, which has been a little bit below the radar. But once upon a time, he was actually a major leader and one of the main champions of climate change legislation back when it was sort of far off the political agenda and was something he was working on with John McCain, wasn't really going anywhere, but kind of got him good press that, well, they had this bipartisan idea, they had this centrist concept called cap and trade, blah, blah, blah. But, the closer we get to actual congressional action on climate change legislation, and the more passing a climate bill becomes a core objective of, liberal political activists and the Democratic Party, the less Joe Lieberman affiliates himself with that cause, because it's not an exciting centrist move anymore for a Democrat to be for a serious climate bill. It's a boring liberal thing that John Kerry and Barbara Boxer.
Wow, is it? I wonder how it's allowed to get that far. But one thing I do notice is that, well, when you talk about how it's become a boring liberal thing. That's because of the way it's moving in the Senate, but it seems that these conservative groups that I've just been talking about and talking to here are really good at changing the narrative on and changing the polls on like any particular policy issue. On climate change, on cap and trade, I remember a year ago, maybe less, maybe a little bit more, that Newt Gingrich was for some sort of cap and trade program, and obviously it'd be silly to expect...
Yeah, he did an ad that had Nancy Pelosi.
It would be silly to expect him to endorse what the Democrats are doing, because he's a venal political actor, but it took a year of messaging from conservative groups and Republicans, and this is at a time when they've dwindled to the least power they've had since the 1970s. And then, there we go. It's become an issue that's controversial for everyone, only liberals believe. It's same thing here. I mean, I look at Skoda Fava, and I remember I was talking to it was Michael Barone last week, who follows every election, but is based in D.C. He's not up in this district, and he just couldn't stop talking about how Skoda Fava was a pawn of Acorn. He had the Working Families Party endorsement, and he didn't really. He's the guy who covers politics pretty closely, and he just, hook, line, and sinker was buying this argument that was pushed by conservative groups, mostly new conservative groups like Andrew Breitbart, whatever, that Acorn is behind so much of what's wrong with America and what's wrong with liberalism. And it just seems like they're incredibly powerful in shaping this. And I used to think that was because cable news covers it a lot, but if you actually go out on the ground there, for all these... for all that liberals have built up, that conservatives are jealous of in some cases, like Media Matters and CAP, they still seem to be able to just maybe not turn people on a dime, but just push these gears so that people become go against what they used to either be indifferent about or support. I mean, with climate change, I think polls last summer said people liked the idea of climate change, but had no idea, or cap and trade, but had no idea what it was. Now they know what it is, and it's become something that Democrats who are worried about re-election are nervous about, and Democrats like Joe Lieberman want to become mavericks on.
Right. I think, polling on sort of energy legislation continues to be very varied under different kinds of terminology, but, it's definitely true that, conservatives have an incredible ability to sort of get people, into line with what they've sort of decided to do, right? I mean, a kind of strategic decision was made at some level by someone that, what they were going to do was defeat Obama's agenda, and not seek to temper it in some kind of way. Because, in most countries, what an opposition party does is it kind of sits on the sideline and puts out press releases about why the government is screwing up and tries to prepare its candidates for the next election. But minorities, actually just don't get a role. They don't have a say in how the country goes. In America, a minority party, even a relatively small one, like the Republicans right now, has a kind of a real ability to impact the course of things. And so you can decide to sort of try to force the incumbents into compromise, or you can try to just kill all their proposals. And, Republicans have really, almost all of them have sort of gone for the latter. And they have, even though I think progressives have built up some organizations that conservatives can be jealous of, conservatives still have a much kind of richer grassroots, and a much more robust ability to sort of communicate to lots of people, in any congressional district, wherever.
They're far better, I think, at controlling a political narrative too. And I use that word too much, but I mean, in this sense, I think they're on the cusp. Whenever this goes up, people will be voting. I think in 2 states and several geographic areas, right? And last year, 50 states held elections, and they elected a president and a Congress. But I just kind of feel the ground shifting, and conservatives successfully trying to argue that if they do really, really well in these elections, then that means Obama's agenda has ground to a halt. I mean, I say this in part because, like, I was talking to some conservative protesters outside this Biden rally, and a few things I noticed were that, one, they were aware of all these elections. I mean, they didn't know the names of all the candidates, but they were aware that Republicans are up in New Jersey and Virginia. And two, they were, like, very aware that if they won them all, well, the way one guy put it to me was that, like, Obama won't be able to get anything else done. So it's Europe, I think, is obsessed with this stuff as I am. I mean, like, parliamentary democracies. That's not how it works in the UK. I mean, I lived there for a while, and there'd be a by-election, and Labour would lose it, and it would be a few weeks at bad headlines, and then Labour goes on steamrolling, getting whatever the hell it wants.
To be fair, I mean, it's not clear that Obama will be able to get anything done, no matter what happens in the elections. I mean, 40 Republican senators seem to have pretty well committed themselves to, filibustering stuff, which just makes it hard to do things. I mean, as you've written on your blog, I mean, Obama can barely get just sort of random executive branch appointments filled. I mean, also with this, New Jersey, Virginia stuff, I mean, I remember in 2001 when Democrats took control of both New Jersey and Virginia with exciting new candidates. And it was, at the time, really sort of buoyed the sails of progressives who were, back then, I mean, it was post 9/11, so you weren't even really, like, allowed to criticize George W. Bush at all. And genuinely, people felt, I think at that point, at least even a lot of Democrats, that he was doing the right thing with regard to Afghanistan, but still,
Mark Warner
people didn't want to.
And Jim McGreevey, at the time, I'm sure they said that. I remember actually one thing that probably killed Mark Green's chances at beating Mike Bloomberg was that he, I think, criticized George Pataki and said, like, he wasn't the leader. Giuliani was the leader. Pataki was holding the leader's coat, and that was a huge scandal. How could this Democrat suggest that George Pataki was not showing as much leadership as Rudy Giuliani?
But I mean, at any rate, I mean, back then, I think a lot of people took Corzine or I'm not sure if it was Corzine, but Mark Warner and whoever was the Democrat in New Jersey winning as Jim McGreevey as a big sign that people liked like how Bush had handled this, but the conservative agenda was like still unpopular. Democrats were like ready to come roaring back in 2002. And it turned out it wasn't like that at all. That local races Virginia and New Jersey are both states that have two competitive political parties, and the races turn largely on state and local issues and conditions. I mean, that if you look at Virginia, that in addition to Cray Deeds sort of being incompetent, they're talking a lot about Virginia transportation funding questions, which is not, Barack Obama didn't win the election in Virginia because they liked his plan for dealing with transportation in Fairfax County. And if it turns out that people don't like Cray Deeds' plan for transportation in Fairfax County, I don't think that has any like real national implications. And he just seems like a horrible candidate.
He is, but I don't think it's unfair to look at these elections. I mean, I've been saying, that they're very good at trying to shift the goalpost and say this matters more than the election we had last year. I don't think it's wrong, though, because Corzine is actually a pretty good barometer for what Democrats are doing, how much patience that voters have with them. Deeds might be a fluke, but Corzine has been arguing explicitly that times are tough. I know that I was governor through these tough times. Things are bouncing back if you continue to empower the Democrats to make these hard decisions instead of letting a governor who promises to cut taxes on everything and has no other ideas comes in. So this was like the argument Jim Florio made in '93 when Clinton was president.
Sure.
The Warner argument back in 2001 was very much more. I mean, I don't remember any issues at all. It was. I mean, he actually promised not to raise taxes.
Yeah.
So, I think conservatives can argue pretty convincingly that. Well, one thing I think right. Warner promised not to raise taxes. Cray Deeds in Virginia, among the things he's accused of being incompetent about, is promising to raise taxes as a bold promise that distinguishes him from these other politicians. And, so you're going to have two Democrats run good government Democratic campaigns. Deeds has, I think, erred in distance himself from like national Democrats because you can't not do this. You can't not be a national Democrat if you're running Virginia. But Corzine's been very. Listen, I don't think conservatives will be wrong if they're like this. This proves that the Democratic agenda is unpopular at the moment. Like, I guess the danger for Democrats is that they look at that and say, well, we better not do anything. Clearly, like.
Well, I wouldn't put it. Well,
Yeah.
Look, I mean, for one thing, I mean, of course, we have actual surveys, statistically valid surveys of American public opinion that we can look at if we want to see, what people think of Democrats and the Democratic agenda, and it shows like Barack Obama is still popular. Mixed results for different aspects of his agenda. What's definitely true, though, is that being an incumbent governor during a recession is a horrible situation because you can't just have a big budget deficit. You have to cut spending and raise taxes, and people don't like either of those things. And, in particular in New Jersey, well, in both New Jersey and Virginia, Republicans get to run for governor on sort of budget numbers that don't add up, right? Where they say, well, we're going to cut taxes, and we're also not going to, cut any popular programs, and so on and so forth. Which, if you time it right, actually can work. I mean, in the 90s, George Pataki and Christy Whitman, and earlier this decade, Crist in Florida sort of rode their way to enormous popularity by taking advantage of localized economic booms to simultaneously cut taxes and keep spending money on
Tommy
things.
Thompson, too. You
But,
can go down the list, yeah.
Yeah, Tommy Thompson. I mean, and Democrats too. I mean, it was in the 90s the economy was good. You're going to find if McDonnell actually becomes governor of Virginia that the things he's saying he will do simply can't be done. I mean, at the national level, if you're George W. Bush and you have budget numbers that don't add up, you can actually keep governing that way for many, many years. And it's a pretty good formula for Bush and for Reagan. But it actually won't work in state government in Virginia or New Jersey. And as we've seen with Arnold Schwarzenegger, it hasn't worked out there in California. But even though it doesn't work, I think it's pretty potent politically.
Well, one thing I'm interested to see is, I think whatever happens, conservatives are going to be, and I'm defining conservatives as the Club for Growth, the Tea Party people right now, are going to be completely empowered by the elections. I think it was, forgetting who it was, but I've already seen somebody making the argument that what Bob McDonnell proves in Virginia is that if you just listen to your conservative base, you can win the election, which I think is exactly the wrong idea to draw from that election, because he's been running basically on like widening I-66 and being moderate, but they're going to be empowered by this.
And on jobs,
And on jobs. But I don't know what they're going to let these people who've been elected get away with. Because, I mean, another point Biden was making today was, these are the least interesting parts of his speech. The more interesting parts are when he went on at length about his late wife and how he used to be a lifeguard in Syracuse and things like that. But when he actually got off that under the politics, he's like, look, can you imagine Doug Hoffman, this Republican candidate, getting to Congress and disagreeing with Rush Limbaugh? And I don't know how, that seems like maybe a petty argument right now, but, you're going to have Chris Christie in New Jersey and Bob McDonnell in Virginia, and, are they actually going to, if they're not Mark Sanford-style governors who just turn down federal aid and unemployment insurance and things like that, then the base is going to be very angry with them and pronounce them traitors. I mean, this is what's happening in Florida. And you've got, I think, I haven't seen the effects quite yet, but Charlie Crist wants to be a senator, and he's running in the primary against this very conservative candidate, Mark Rubio. And, Crist has just flipped completely on whether the stimulus is working and what we should do to fix the economy, and, whether or not Barack Obama should have contact with other humans. I mean, he's just... it really is the conservative base, I think, is going to be, despite being a very small portion of the country, what is it, 20% who like the Republican Party at the moment?
It's like 25. I mean, it's
they become this fulcrum for a lot of national politics, and people are just calling them up and listening to what they have to say and what they're angry about. So, like, after these guys get elected, if Chris Christie's governor of New Jersey, I think he'll actually do some attention-getting reforms and stuff like that. But if he's like making a hard budget choice, then he'll be drummed out of the movement, just as Christie Whitman was.
I think that the concern to have is that we really have seen a preview in California because of its sort of unique 2/3 budgeting rule of what you can do with a very sort of empowered conservative minority in that state. They can't and don't win any elections there, but they have enough support in the state legislature to do what they want and always block any kind of tax increases. And it's led them to a state of total public financial crisis. And I think you'll see the same thing. I mean, it's an absolute baseline for sort of conservative activists that you be quite strictly anti-tax, completely across the board. And there's really no jurisdiction in the United States that can be governed consistent with those kind of principles. But recent electoral things have, as you've said, have made conservatives more empowered, not less empowered. And, if they want to make the case of pure political strategy, it's true that, while there may be some things moving to the center on is helpful on, there's no evidence that moving to the center on taxes is more politically useful than sort of a far-right stance. The problem is just that you can't run the country that way, and you can't really run a state that way, and there's no successful examples of anyone doing it. You know what I mean? We don't have any instances of a governor coming into a state and actually enacting, huge reductions in public expenditures. We have sort of tax cuts during good times. We have sort of budget flim-flam. But not at the federal level and not at the state level. No one has just said, we're not going to have schools, and so that's why we can afford these tax cuts.
We have reforms of entitlements that not everyone, and more specifically not the median white swing voter enjoys, I suppose. We have, I think, what were the first things to go in California? It was child care for 4 children and some college tuition payment, some funding for schools. I'm thinking of the governors who were successful in the '90s did cut things, but they were cutting welfare or reforming welfare in Wisconsin.
But also, there
hasn't been a painful Grover Norquist's Grover Norquist's plan for government. We're going to enact it. This state will be a laboratory for getting rid of all these services.
Well, and Wisconsin in the '90s, I actually think is a great example of this because Tommy Thompson really changed welfare in Wisconsin. A great deal, and it was a big deal, his reforms, but he didn't actually reduce the volume of money expended on it. He cut people off the dole sooner, and he took that extra money and he plowed it into doing more services to sort of connect people with jobs. And so it was a sort of get tough on welfare recipients sort of policy, but it wasn't in budgetary terms a cost saver. That's what you don't have. So I guess I'm saying, you have examples of sort of conservative politicians who governed successfully, Thompson, Rudy Giuliani, some others, but none of them succeeded through this kind of, tearing down of the welfare state.
Problem I have with Republicans at the moment is that I can't really conceptualize what they do if they rolled 7 and got control of both houses of Congress in 2 years in 1 year, because Barack Obama would still be president, and people give too much credit to the Contract for America. It was kind of cobbled together right before the election, but you had years and years of Republican thinking about government reform that went into that, and a lot of it was good government reform about committee chairmanships, services they were allowed to use, things like that. Right now, you've got I think probably a better organized, definitely better organized activist base. Conservative media is just as popular, but I don't quite know what they want to do if they control things. And if the things I do know, I'm not sure would work. I think you've got if you take them seriously on their tax and spending policies, they basically want to do what failed in the Herbert Hoover administration and drastically cut spending, cut taxes at a point when basically they haven't really decided that we have a demand problem. They still think that
their talk about spending cuts, right? I mean, it's telling whenever you hear someone talk about an across-the-board cut in spending, because nobody thinks, no matter how much you love or hate government spending, that each and every program is equally valuable, right? I mean, but so talking about these cuts across the board is a way of saying, of not saying actually what you're going to cut, right? I mean, the day I see a sort of Republican senator not talk about an across-the-board spending cuts, but instead saying, I'm going to cut spending on the FBI, I'm going to cut spending on the Bureau of Prisons, I'm going to cut spending on the National Parks.
Well, some of them do. I mean, Jim DeMint says that.
Then I'll believe that they have some kind of agenda to do that. For now, I think it's like, you're on TV for like a minute, right? And so you need a sentence you can say that kind of sounds all right. And some of this stuff, well, we should freeze spending. It totally fulfills that criteria. And I don't think it fulfills the criteria of, standing up to scrutiny of, writing a bill, having a committee markup process, having leaks come about what's going on, when it turns out that, of course, each member has the programs that they like and, don't want to have cut. I mean, as you've seen just with the Democrats over the past year, it's one thing to sort of have stuff everyone can agree to say on the campaign trail, and another thing entirely to actually go and do it. And that's over and apart from the fact that, I think given the economic circumstances, it would be sort of devastating to the country to actually do.
I think a lot of this is a failure of Barack Obama. Maybe it was a necessary failure because he wanted to get elected president, but conservatives have no qualms about you explaining their economic thinking, and maybe they'll resort too often to stories about Ronald Reagan and to kind of homilies and things about the founders, but they'll go out and explain, we want spending cuts, we want the government to live within its means, we want tax cuts, and Barack Obama ran for president promising spending cuts and attacking Bush's tax cuts and attacking Bush's spending. Now, he was able to do that because people still don't trust the Republicans to cut spending, but the upshot of that is voters still trust Republicans to cut, still want spending cuts writ large, and that's generally a problem I think for liberals because they can't really be a social democratic party without convincing people that you need to spend more money on goods on services and healthcare and things like that. But especially in a recession, where really the White House seems ashamed to make a Keynesian case for what it's doing. It just seems ridiculous to me when Barack Obama will talk about health care and, promise not to raise the taxes of anyone, under a certain bracket. I think be honest. If you had your way and you would give people the choice, taxes would be a little bit higher and everyone would have more services just like Europe. I don't think liberals are, I guess Republicans attack them for this, but, liberals think the European states have figured out this stuff a bit better than we have, and we should adopt that. I think great, but if you're not honest about that, I guess it's a way to win some elections, but you never shift the frame if you never talk about it. Republicans just every day are able to fill the airwaves by talking about supply-side tax cuts and small businesses and living within their means and live with total pride and confidence. And that's what I think. Again, if I don't know how big the spin will be. If there's a Democratic rout and they lose everything that's up on Tuesday, then it'll just be Obama's not popular. But I think the more important lesson will be you can't. Nobody really made the case for the economics you need in this recession. So Republicans gained. And Democrats are going to cower when it comes to this stuff still, and not shift anything. The point of all these elections is that if the economy were good right now, I think Corzine would be easily winning. Democrats probably pick up that seat. Deed's a bad candidate.
Right. I mean, that's what I was going to say, is that, beyond sort of making the case, right, I mean, it's just true that the economy is in bad shape. And I think, I don't know that this is the lesson that will be taken away, but the lesson that the White House should take away is that, if unemployment is at 9.5% and rising, people get mad and they vote for the party that's out of power. And you have to do something. I mean, not just say things that are persuasive, but I mean, really take actions that will improve economic conditions in people's lives. Because, you just don't win when objective conditions are like this.
They need to explain to people why. I guess it makes sense that it's painful for people to live through this stuff and be told that these programs that don't immediately seem beneficial are going to fix everything for them. But I think maybe you argued this in a blog post arguing with more optimistic Democrats that this might be a 1932 style election situation, but the point we're in this recession might be more like 1930. So Democrats are going to get in and take all the blame for this stuff. And I actually think, Democrats controlled Congress for the last 2 years of Hoover's term and were able to run and win anyway.
Right.
I think we had let's see, I'm trying to just remember election results from the early 30s. Democrats went through lots of periods of things not going very well, but promised. But could point to what they were doing and the arguments for them that Republicans had failed arguments, and it seemed to these aren't iron rules, but I just think there's no intellectual tug of war right now. It really is Democrats apologizing for trying to fix Bush's mistakes, but Republicans claiming that they basically pretend the Bush presidency never happened and arguing that we need more supply side economics.
I do think, though, I mean, if you look at politics in the 30s, I mean, the Republicans sweep to a huge win in 28. But by 1930, things have gotten bad. So Democrats pick up ground in Congress. In 32, things are even worse. So Democrats sweep in. By 34, I mean, things are still bad in 34, but they're much better than they had been 2 years ago. So Democrats make further gains. In 36, things are even better. So Democrats get more gains. Then in 37, 38, things go downhill again. And Republicans come... start making their comeback there.
But they go downhill because of budget balancing, right? I mean,
Oh, yeah. Well, right. I mean, it's just that it's not that the public didn't exhibit a consistent theory about macroeconomic policy management. What they did was they saw were conditions improving or were conditions getting worse, and punished incumbents when things were getting worse, and rewarded them when things were getting better, and that's sort of. In some ways, I think just a healthy instinct on the part of voters, because it means that wise politicians, at least, will spend a little bit less time, worrying about sort of what's in the media narratives, and a little bit more time, if they really understand this, just saying, what I have to do is do some things such that next time I go to the election, I can say to people, things are better now. And the problem for John Corzine is that, it's not, I think, really his fault, but I mean, things are not better than they were last time New Jersey had a gubernatorial election. Things are worse. It's hard to get reelected in that climate.
I don't know. I think there are Democratic governors who've been more diligent, more successful than he has.
Sure.
I mean, Corzine's a weird figure because he basically, through successive elections, compensated for his lack of political connections by buying lots of things.
Yeah.
So he's never had to make. Usually voters reward a guy like that because they think he's beyond all this. Like Corzine, because the way New Jersey is, ends up just buying into lots of local party machines and wasting a lot of time.
And he's had a strange career too.
But I definitely
you don't
I
see
think
a lot of senators run for governor.
Christie has made a coherent argument though that he's done more time, tended more to these narrow interests than emergency plan for the state. And I think it's shallow. I mean, and Christie's not winning by a landslide because he has run a pretty shallow campaign about this. But the point is, there are things Democrats can do. I think the other side is I think voters if they're not, even if they're not completely schooled in economics, are right to think that we can't like have a huge unsustainable debt for a long time, and that if entitlements are going to cost a lot more money, then they're a bad idea. Like, it's just that if right now Republicans are able to argue that things aren't working, and they've got these very simple ideas that would fix everything, and like, I don't think Democrats should be so surprised if voters decide to go to reward them for that. At the same time, I don't think a lot of these elections are going to be held with voters who, compared to 2008, are less Democratic and more Republican. Like, there'll be people who voted for Obama and come out. People who couldn't bring themselves to vote for McCain who do come out. Like, that electorate's going to shift because conservatives are angrier. But like, I don't like. It's not my job to convince Democrats what they can do to get people motivated. I don't know what would it take. Like, is it?
Well, I mean, this is a whole other discussion. But I mean, I think this goes back to why. I mean, Cray Deeds is doing way worse than the other Democrats in these situations because he has, I think, completely failed to, give Democrats, like a real reason to see a stake in this, right? I mean, he doesn't project at all that he is like continuing the fight that Barack Obama and Tim Kaine and whomever else were or are involved with. He's running a kind of, more like what you expect from a Democrat trying to run in Mississippi kind of, race, completely disavowing sort of all the main policy objectives of the Obama administration, that kind of thing. And, the result of that is that he's still suffering from the same problems that the other Democrats running this fall have, but he doesn't even have the advantage of, any kind of motivated base of support.
Well, I know he's alienated a lot of Democrats. Like, there's an influential Democratic blogger, Ben Tribbett, who blogs in Larry Sabato, who's just been on a campaign to, like, find people who will not vote for Deeds and, like, write something on the ballot because Deeds kind of bumbled into saying he might opt Virginia out of the public option. So, like, that's
lots of stuff.
Yeah, I think, there's, like, time to do a nice analysis of these elections. I honestly, just for academic sake, it'd be more useful if Democrats like squeak through in one of these. So the story is not just like Republican landslide and why Democrats are doomed, because that's actually not why this will happen. There's like all these complicated reasons. But like going through, is the Democratic base actually? Are they frustrated about the economy, or are they like why would they not be turning out in a state like New Jersey? Like, because like Obama's been going there to like rev them up, but they're definitely not as interested in voting for Corzine as they were. Forget Barack Obama, as they were for like Bob Menendez in 200006. Like, why is that? Why is that right now?
I think opposition figures don't make the same kind of good villains, and I think there's just a real sense of there's a kind of, I think the politically unproductive kind of frustration has taken set, I think, with a lot of Democrats, right, who made a lot of emotional investment into the 2006 and 2008 elections, and, haven't seen totally what they wanted out of it and are becoming, I think, flipping from having been sort of too hopeful and too optimistic and a little too taken with the kind of Obama persona and stuff like that, over to a point of being too cynical about it. There's a kind of, I think something conservatives have going for them is, over the course of decades, I think a kind of hard-won but realistic attitude toward the political process, where they understand that getting what they want is difficult, and that the reason you get what you want is by having the organization to force people to do what you want. Whereas on the left, there's much more a kind of cycle of infatuation with people followed by disillusionment with them, rather than a kind of year after year building of the organizations that create the context where you can take for granted that most Republicans will do what conservatives want, but that's not because they've like all found really great guys. It's just because the conservative movement has really built that power, and it took decades. Right?
I'm curious.
I mean, they didn't like come out and caucus for Ronald Reagan one time, and like that's why the Republican Party is conservative.
I'm curious. What do you think has been the long-term impact of the Ned Lamont, Joe Lieberman race? Because I've been noticing a lot of political commentary that connects that to New York 23. They're different for a bunch of reasons. I mean, I think the main one is that there is no overarching real policy issue that could be changed by this election, the way there was with Lieberman.
Right.
If I could characterize like what conservatives are fighting for in New York 23, it's like really everything Glenn Beck is fighting for. I was like, I see the signs they're waving, and it's like they're anti-Acorn, they're anti-Pelosi, they're anti-UN. Right. It's like it's a hodgepodge of conservative reasons, but like the Lamont thing, do you think that had any lasting impact? Because you must be aware at the same time that the responsible, like David Broder figures of the world are saying, the reason New York 23 might be bad for Republicans is because, obviously the Lamont-Lieberman race was devastating for Democrats and, empowered their fringe.
I write about this all the time, but there's like a long-term, large-scale structural transformation of American politics toward more polarized legislative caucuses. And you see individual instances of this happening. Ned Lamont running against Lieberman. You see it in how Specter not only switched parties, but has like flipped to being like a left-wing Democrat. You see it in the conservative base's rejection of Scozzafozza. You see it in sort of, the fact that there's now like a nationwide audience reading mean things written about Mary Landrieu on the internet. Which is just a change from how America used to work. When it's like,
that's very new. I mean, not to distract you, but one thing I noticed like about the rise of the Huffington Post and people like that is like you've got reporters who actually will file stories about like the Progressive Caucus instead of just like chasing down the Blue Dog for that quote. And you've got people who, when they write about Blue Dogs, are like, actually, Mike Ross has no idea what he's talking about, as opposed to Mike Ross strode into the bar, tipped his hat, and and took charge. Like it's, I think there's a little, that's been, but that's still defined. Isn't that still defined outside? Like there's this left-wing fringe, and then meanwhile there's the real conservative base that represents real America.
But that's because the conservative base has proven themselves for decades in a way that I think the progressive base just hasn't. I think that it's possible that progressives will do things, this year, next year, the following year, and so forth, that make some of the sneering that's been done look foolish in retrospect. But the reason the sneering happens is because there's just not, there's not the track record of victory. At best, you get sort of these kind of half wins, like Lamont seizing the Democratic nomination and then, not being able to go over the top, or Barack Obama winning the nomination, winning the election, but then maybe not even being able to get his agenda passed, right?
Certainly.
If things work out, attitudes will change, right? But I mean, the conservative, what's happening in this New York congressional race is interesting and it's novel. But the conservative movement in America flexing its political muscle and getting its way is like not a new story. It's a story everyone's prepared to believe it could happen here because it happened in the 1964 presidential election, because it happened when Ronald Reagan governed the country for 8 years. That kind of thing. So people are always, they have their noses up, right, for sort of like the next right-wing victory. I think I should probably shut this off now.
Yeah, that's a good point to shut it off. I mean,
all right.
It's this New York 23 race. Like, there's going to be a ton of writing about it, and some of it will be shallow. I think, but
for the real depth, you want to have people talking on the internet.
That's what you want. You want people's heads
streaming
phones.
Video.
But
that's where the insight.
But no, I think after this is over, people really should go back to like the tradition of conservatives knocking people off and the tradition of, it's not going to be as simple as I think it's spun. But I mean, I think it does fall in this tradition. Well, I mean, thanks for doing this.
Yeah, good talking to you.
Good talking to you.
Have fun in Upstate.
It always is. Thanks.